So I want to switch gears here. It's kind of a couple of book reviews. A few weeks ago, we had an opportunity to speak with an individual who wrote this book called The Absent Superpower. This is a book, if you're interested in geopolitical issues, is really worth reading. This person also wrote another book called The Accidental Superpower 3 years ago, which, if you read it, you would almost say was going to predict the rise of somebody like Trump as a leader in the US for the reasons we're going to get to in a minute. And part of this is related to the trends in the US that basically put Trump exactly in the right place at the right time to get elected. So this is Peter Zeihan, and we had an opportunity to spend a couple of hours with Peter to go over his book, to go over the issues and stuff like that. And while we might not agree with 100% of everything he says, at the end of the day, he makes a lot of sense on three things. These are the major themes he has. The first is the increase in US isolationism. The second is the impact of demographics, not just on the States, but around the world. And the huge impact and the game changer that shale oil is in the US. So let's look at each one of those. We wrote a newsletter right after the election about the Trump election. And interestingly, ever since then, The Economist magazine has been enthralled. Now, The Economist magazine hates Donald Trump. But at the end, it sells a lot of magazines. So they just love him on the cover. I think he's been on 6 covers in the last 6 months. So it's kind of like a, what is that? It's like a swimwear edition of the Economist, right? And this is one cartoonist's idea of where Trump could start building his wall, with the idea that it would make him quieter. But I don't actually think that would be particularly effective. We don't really know where the wall is going to be. Is it going to be, just across the states, or is it going to be all around the US and really try to keep everybody out, including us? But one cartoonist felt, well, okay, assuming a wall is built, and assuming Donald is as paranoid as he generally is, he would want to stay close to that wall. And as long as he does stay close to make sure nobody's getting across it, people will figure out a way to get across it. They'll just basically climb over his hair. So some of these things can be resolved. 2 things that have happened to him already. Well, one thing that's happened and one thing that's about to happen. The first is that he wanted to destroy Obamacare, and he got, if you will, trumped. Mainly, interestingly, by his own party. Not just people to the right, extreme right of that party, that don't want anything to do with any kind of national health care, but the people to the left who didn't like the idea that somewhere around 25 million of their constituents would be without coverage that already now have it. And it's one thing to say, I'm not going to provide a benefit to you, and quite another to say, I'm taking the benefit you have and I'm going to keep it. And that's an interesting political problem for the Republicans. The second issue is, and Rob referred to this, the issue of tax reform. Part of the issue of tax reform is to reduce taxes corporately and personally, generally to pretty wealthy people. And that has to be paid for in some way, shape, or form, especially for Republicans who don't want to have an increased deficit. Border taxes were going to be the way a large part of that could have been recovered basically through import taxes, effectively this VAT. The problem with that, even if it's a good idea, even if most other countries in the world do it, is there are a lot of opponents to a border tax, and the biggest opponents are the Koch brothers, who are the largest contributors to the Republican Party and will do anything to prevent this from going through. And the real interesting question is, it doesn't take much, basically, to prevent this kind of legislation from going through without it getting watered down a lot. So whatever the tax reform is going to be, it'll be interesting to see what the final results turn out. Regardless, this has created a sense of populism, not just in the States. This populism is going on everywhere. There was the Brexit vote last year. Marine Le Pen will be running, having a series of 2 elections in France. She has a very good chance of getting into the runoff. She even has a small chance of winning the runoff and becoming the president. And Geert Wilders just recently ran in the Netherlands. He's more or less the same as Marine Le Pen. He got 2nd place, didn't win, but he has 19% of the vote, and he has influence on Dutch policy in terms of what they're going to do, especially as it relates to immigration. This kind of populism is expanded everywhere. You see it in Hungary, in Poland, in Turkey, in the Philippines. So it's going on all over. And it raises an interesting question, what's going on here? So about a year ago, maybe a bit less than a year ago, we got this newsletter from a bank credit analyst, which just was trying to take a look at the so-called 1% issue. What is the 1% problem? And it made an observation that these two countries, this is France and the US, in terms of their the wealth in the top 1%, going all the way back to 1910. During the Gilded Age of the US, it was a high concentration of wealth amongst a very small amount of people. In the case of the US, almost 50%, over 60% in France. And that decreased constantly for the next several decades, bottoming out in the 70s. And there was a 25% swing in wealth concentration between the US and France in that time frame. But for the last 40 years, the concentration of wealth has been rising. So the first thing is, are the 1% getting wealthier both in terms of assets and in terms of income? Absolutely yes. So that's part of this story, the narrative. The question is, where is it occurring? So what you're looking at here is a graph that they also included. If you're on the left-hand side, you can see that the higher you go, the less upwardly mobile you are. And on the bottom axis, the more you are to the right, the higher the income inequality is of that particular country. So when we look at the US, the UK, and Italy, they are absolutely the least upwardly mobile and the most unequal in terms of income, which may surprise a lot of people that people in the US are not upwardly mobile, but that's what shifted. There's where that level of frustration comes in. Interestingly, here we are actually in a pretty good place. So I was going to send this to the Liberals and see if it had any impact on them, but they already know my voting record, so I don't think that's going to be effective. The next thing that Peter talked about was demographics. And the question is our demographics destiny? This is a graph of what will happen over the next roughly 35 years. The population that is over the age of 60 will increase by 130% around the world. So this is not simply an issue for developed countries, it is an issue for all countries. And if we take a look at what the impact of aging is, things like this happen. As you age, certain attributes occur. One of them is memory. 2 signs of aging. First, you forget things, and then I can never remember the second. And the other thing is, my wife and I go to Maui every winter, and we try to stay active, like a lot of people our age. So we play tennis and we cycle and stuff like that. So I have some buddies of mine. This is a picture of 3 other guys, but basically we do the same thing. And when you're my age, you want to pretend that you are as fit and as fast and as strong as you were when you're 30. Now, you can pull that off if the only people you do things with are all over 60. It's kind of a physical version of Einstein's theory of relativity. You just basically stay with the group that you started with. So here are 3 guys here, and they're having a conversation. Now, they're trying to look buff. They're doing their best. They're probably working out pretty hard. But certain things about aging you just can't hide. And one of them is hearing. It's not just your memory. So the first guy said, "It's windy today." And the second guy said, "No, it's Thursday." And the third guy says, "So am I, let's get a beer." So fortunately, nobody else could hear this conversation. And when we talk about senior moments, the interesting thing that the US has, which Zeihan argues is a compelling advantage for the US, is they have a very efficient birth rate, a replacement birth rate, a 2.1. So here's a graph of countries between 2015 and 2050 looking at the median age of their population. And in the case of China, the median age is going to go from 35 to 46 in the next less than 35 years. In the US, it's only going to go from 37 to 41. They will go from being slightly older than China to significantly younger. That is a compelling advantage from a GDP growth perspective. In fact, when we take a look at it around the world, Japan, Russia, Germany are just some of the countries that are going to suffer significant population declines. China will basically break even. The US is going to have a growth rate of 28% in the next 35 years. Essentially, that's just about 100 million new Americans. So a very significant growth factor. And
birth rate or immigration?
that's a combination of birth rate and immigration. The immigration policy in the U.S. is not as, quote, generous as Canada. So they have 1 million immigrants a year. Of course, if the Donald had his way, it would be a lot less than that. Relatively speaking, we are at between 250 and 300,000. So we, in theory, we would be 1/10 their size. So we are having 2.5 times as many immigrants per capita as the U.S. does, which we need because our birth rate is no different than that of China's. We're at 1.6 compared to the U.S. being at 2.1. The other things that impact the demographics, the older you are, the more you save. And when you take a look at it in relation to spending, your peak spending typically happens around age 50, significantly declines as you get older. So essentially that is a question to ask. Is that deflationary? Is the reason interest rates can be so low, employment relatively robust, stock market robust, and yet there are hardly any signs of inflation? At the end of the day, spending has to take place in a significant way. If you have an aging population, is this trend going to be constantly there to impact and reduce the long-term levels of inflation over time? And in turn, would that change the long-term level of interest rates over time? Another thing he talks about is shale oil. Since roughly about a decade ago, the U.S. has reduced its oil imports by 65% while increasing its gas production by 60%. So when you take a look at it as the U.S. as a net energy importer, it has dropped by just a huge amount in a very short period of time, to the point now, depending on what measurements you use, if you include coal or gas liquids, they're already essentially a net energy exporter. And if you don't measure those things, they will be in the next few years. So here's a question. If the U.S. can basically supply all of its energy needs, why would it care about the Middle East? I mean, what's in it for them? What's the benefit to them? They're not going to be using the oil anyway. They have been using the oil, but do they care in the future if they don't need it? So these are the observations he makes. The demographic issues matter. In this case, the U.S. wins. Shale oil is a game changer. Globalization is under pressure all over the world. Part of those are populism reasons. The U.S. is more independent perhaps than any other single country, and that's basically because the U.S. is not really a country, it's a continent. Russia is aging and in decline, and the euro shows how hard it is to have an effective currency when you have a monetary union, but you don't have a fiscal union. So the U.S. wins from Zeihan's perspective on a whole lot of fronts, and I think that there's more than a few things here that resonate true as far as we can see.